Now, there we go. Very loud. All right. Good morning, Council. Emily Swetzig, Budget Director. I'm joined today by my colleagues from the finance team. Do you guys want to introduce yourselves?
Mark Gasway, Clark County Finance Director.
Hi, and good morning, Council. Sarah Lowe, Chief Deputy Treasurer in the Clark County Treasurer's Office.
We're here today to bring some information forward, specifically about the general fund and the current general fund forecast, and provide some feedback and get some direction from the council about some next steps. Next slide, please. So the finance team is currently working through a series of proposed strategies to help balance the 6-year forecast for the general fund and provide recommendations for the upcoming 2027 annual budget adoption process. Sorry, I have to wear my readers, but the finance team recommendation is to address general fund structural deficit through a deliberate and sustainable approach that focuses on bending the curve over time. The objective is to simply not to balance a single year forecast, but to look at the 6-year forecast as a whole, which is a GFOA best practice. This approach recognizes that achieving long-term fiscal sustainability requires thoughtful evaluation of both current services and future financial commitments. By gradually narrowing the gap between recurring revenues and recurring expenditures, the county can create a space to carefully address critical operational needs, evaluate policy choices, and understand how financial assumptions and decisions will affect the county's long-term financial outlook. The finance team recommends a methodical strategy that allows the council, the county manager, elected officials, and leadership to make informed decisions over time rather than relying on one-time solutions and abrupt reductions. This approach also acknowledges the reality that these conversations will not be limited to a single budget cycle. As costs continue to increase, inflationary pressures persist, and new state and federal mandates are incorporated into county operations, the general fund will continue to face ongoing structure pressures and require annual review and adjustment. Ultimately, the goal is to establish a sustainable financial framework and continue the core county services while positioning the organization to proactively respond to future challenges and changing community needs.
And just before we go on, can you clarify what GFOA stands for the public?
Yes, it's the Government Finance Officers Association. Next slide, please. This is a slide that we've presented in many budget cycles over the past couple of years, just talking a little bit about the general fund and some of the challenges it's facing. Over 2/3 of the county's general fund expenses are personnel related for salaries and benefits. And expenses are continuing to grow due to the need for wage increases, requiring us to be competitive in the local job market, medical contributions, and then state mandated retirement rate increases. Unfortunately, the general fund 6-year forecast continues to face the ongoing challenge of a structural deficit, and this is a systemic problem that results from expenses growing faster than revenues. As with many of the previous budget cycles, requests submitted for new general fund needs always outweigh the revenue available to pay for those needs. Next slide, please. So this slide reflects the general fund 6-year forecast that was presented as part of the 2026 annual budget adoption process in December of 2025. The adopted budget incorporated several revenue enhancements, including increases to 6211 fee revenues, the allowable 1% property tax levy increase, along with available banked capacity, and other one-time revenue assumptions such as higher interest earnings. On the expenditure side, the adopted budget demonstrated significant restraint and careful evaluation of ongoing spending commitments. New recurring expenditures were approved for mandated services and highly urgent operational needs. Recognizing that additional ongoing costs would further increase pressures to the county's structural deficit and long-term financial outlook. For the 2026 annual budget process, the Budget Office also facilitated a parallel critical needs process in which departments and offices identified and submitted critical needs that were not mandated or otherwise included in the annual budget process. The purpose of this effort was to better understand the scope and magnitude of countywide service needs, staffing, and operational and other capital needs, while acknowledging the general fund's limited capacity to absorb additional ongoing costs. This process, while it provided valuable insight into unmet organizational needs, created an opportunity to discuss potential funding strategies and policy options for addressing those needs, given the county's existing structural deficit. The result was a balanced budget for 2026, but a 2027 outlook that would require the county to continue the conversation about the reality of the structural deficit during the next annual budget process. And that brings us to where we are today. Next slide, please. This is the current general fund 6-year forecast. The most significant change from the forecast presented during the 2026 budget adoption process is the increase to the beginning fund balance in 2026, which is primarily attributable to 2025 expenditure savings. These savings include vacancy savings, delayed expenditures, and the carry forward of budgeted capital projects and other appropriations into 2026. I don't know if there's anything else you would add to that.
Sorry about that. As we report at the end of each year, we report on the actual revenues and expenditures. And so the difference between the budget and the actual expenditures for the year in the operating section was about $10 million. And then we also deferred about $10 million of capital projects. And so that's why there was a difference between the beginning fund balance in the original slide versus this slide.
For this particular forecast, it's important to note that it does not incorporate any new funding requests, any future policy decisions, or additional expenditures beyond those currently approved and included in the 2026 adopted budget. As a result, the forecast should be viewed as a continuation of existing service levels and commitments under current assumptions. The county's longstanding budgeting practice has been to fully budget authorized positions, operating costs, and ongoing commitments to ensure adequate appropriations are available to support service delivery. While this approach provides operational flexibility and ensures departments have sufficient spending authority, actual expenditures are typically lower than budgeted amounts due to vacancies, hiring delays, project timing differences, and other unspent appropriations. These year-end savings are returned to fund balance and become available for reappropriation or carry forward and other future budgetary needs. Historically, these recurring savings have played a significant role in helping the county to sustain existing service levels despite the general fund structural deficit. The resulting fund balance has been used to support subsequent budget adoptions and help bridge the gap between recurring revenues and recurring expenditures. While reliance on year-end savings and fund balance is not generally considered a long-term best practice for achieving structural balance, it has been a reality for the county's financial environment for many years and has helped lessen the immediate impacts of the structural deficit while we look for longer-term solutions. Next slide, please. So this next slide talks about some of the one-time solutions that the finance team has brought forward. As with prior budget cycles, the budget office and finance team begin the annual budget development process by reviewing the general fund 6-year forecast and evaluating key assumptions related to revenues, expenditures, policy decisions, economic conditions, and anticipated operational changes. This review helps identify emerging financial pressures and provides the foundation for developing recommendations that support the county's long-term fiscal sustainability. Over the past several budget cycles, and I really want to thank the finance team and all the members on it, we come together every year about this time, a little bit earlier, and we look at everything to try to come up with solutions to help with the process. And we've been able to implement a variety of one-time solutions that have helped improve the county's projected financial input for the general fund. We have some current one-time strategies that include recognizing available one-time revenue sources and maximizing the use of existing restricted resources. One of those strategies is the recognition of one-time revenue adjustments for public utility district tax revenues, as well as interest earnings, and then also looking at transferring about $7 million of one-time general fund approved capital projects over to REIT 2. Next slide, please. So these are some ongoing recommendations, as well as some things for the council to possibly consider. The first item is recognition of the ongoing revenue adjustment that would be 6211 probation fee revenues of about $1.5 million per year. and then the 2026 sales tax performance, which, as we had conversations in the last budget cycle, we revised our year-over-year growth estimates for 2026 from 4.2% to 2.5%, just on the way that 2025 was performing. We are seeing over the first 6 months of this year that sales tax is actually performing better than that 2.5%. So we're anticipating if trends continue and the year plays out as it's looking, we'll have an additional $1 million of sales tax above what was budgeted. The second bullet item talks about a conversation that council had a couple of weeks ago. There was a work session about the House Bill 2442, which allows the council to pull the subordinate levies out of the general fund and assess those as separate standalone levies. We are building that into a forecast that you'll see in a couple slides, that it increases the general fund revenue of about 2.7 million based on the current rates. That amount doesn't reflect what those projected higher rates would be starting in January 2027, because it's not part of our forecast yet. So that would be something that the finance team recommends moving forward with. I know it will come back to council for formal final decision, but that is one of a really helpful thing, as you'll see in the forecast moving forward. The finance team is also suggesting a 2.5% general fund cut for all department and offices operating budgets. This is a slow, one of our attempts to look at that bending the curve by reducing expenses overall, but not impacting with huge, reactive cuts based on a lot of these other things that could be considered. We're also talking about the audit of general fund transfers and subsidies, and we're reviewing those right now. It's a work in process. There's a slide coming up that I'll go into more detail about that. There's also talk about consideration of additional cuts for departments and offices in 2028 if needed. Again, we played with some scenarios, and based on all of these decisions that are happening this year and what's the council adopts for the annual budget process, we can look at it again next year, and that might be something that we bring back forward as a consideration if the curve is not bending enough to prevent the structural deficit from being realized, or if new appropriations put us in a more dire situation. We also recommend consideration of the 1% property tax levy for 2027, as well as consideration of the 1% property tax levy for future years. I know this is something that council votes on every year. It's part of the annual budget process, and council members may change over the years, but we want to show and talk about how that impact plays out with the financial forecast moving forward and how important that can be towards sustaining avoiding that structural deficit from continuing. The last two bullets considering consideration for the use of the new Law and Justice Support Fund revenues to offset existing law and justice expenses in the general fund. This is something that we're putting in this work session, but there'll be additional consideration of that, I think, in the next work session, and consideration to pursue new voter-approved revenues. So those are some of the proposed long-term strategies that would make ongoing difference to the structure of the fund.
Chair.
Emily, we have a couple questions.
You
I
bet.
think.
Yeah, Emily, before we get to further, although there's not a lot left, just a really quick question on some of the possible ongoing solutions. You mentioned 2.5 general fund cuts for departments and offices, and also consideration of an additional cuts for departments and offices in 2028. In your analysis, which departments do you think would be the most affected if we were to support this ongoing solution?
I think just a ratio of the number, and we have a slide coming up, you'll see, but the smaller the department in the office, potentially the larger the cut. I can speak for myself for the budget office. I'll be cutting positions, and we're such a small office, that would be a huge strain on us, but we can talk about that in just a
Thank
minute.
you. It's the next slide.
Okay.
Great.
Sorry, just
Thank you.
No problem.
I do have a question. Could you explain a little bit more the audit of general fund transfers and subsidies to other funds? What
I
would that
will.
entail?
Yes, and it comes right after the slide
okay.
about departments. I probably went too into much detail on this slide, but
All
we'll get to that,
right.
okay?
We can hardly wait.
Council, I just wanted to make one comment. As we reported with 2025, every year when you go through the budgeting process, you budget at full cost. And I want to make sure that the council understands that. So when you're budgeting at full cost, that means if you've approved a position, we have to make sure that there's funds available for that. And so that's our county's budget process. When we get to the end of the year, we tally everything up and we find out what we've spent. This last year in 2025 was the first time that we spent more in operations than we received in revenue. And we've talked about that a few times now. When the 2026 budget was put together, again, it was put together so that it would be fully budgeted. And you see that deficit number that comes up on the screen of the operations piece. That was the piece that we asked to be assigned out of fund balance. We can use fund balance one time to help balance the budget, but eventually we run out of fund balance. And so that's the ongoing effort that we get together every year to try and say, how do we match our operations revenues and our operating expenses? Because that's where the deficit, structural deficit happens. It's the difference in operations. And by moving out things like capital, we can move those out to other funds. That helps us just focus on the operations piece. So as you look at the impact of some of these suggestions, it's trying to balance the operating revenues and the operating expenses every year so that we don't have to use fund balance. So, and that's what we're going to get into.
Okay, next slide, please. So this slide is the 2027 baseline operating budget by department. And it does show in the first column what those baseline numbers are. And then the second column in blue is the 2.5% amount for departments. There's the item in green is something that it's revenue coming in, revenue going out. So it's expense going out. So it's not really something that can be cut. And I just highlighted contingency as a whole. That is something that the budget office prepares as part of the annual budget process to address unknown contract negotiations with unions and potential wage increases based on assumptions that we get. So we set aside that money each year for use as those contracts are finalized, so to make sure we can cover those salaries and benefits the following year once those contracts are negotiated. I will say, you know, the years that we were going through the Baker-Tilly study, and those lot of changes during those years, contingency was highly used, and that was very helpful. More than not, if we are accurately budgeting salaries and benefits and there's not huge changes throughout the budget year, we often have quite a bit of savings in contingency, and that always falls back to fund balance. But it is there to potentially fulfill those wage agreements if needed. Are there any questions on this slide?
So yeah, now I do. Thank you, Chair. So going back to the prior page under proposed strategies, slide deck number 7, the proposed 2.5 reduction in general fund cuts takes into consideration if we approve the 1% property tax, or does it take into consideration if we don't approve it?
The next slide, two slides from now, you'll see the forecast. It does include the 1%
Okay.
as an assumed decision for this particular forecast. I do understand that it's a council decision. I'm not implying that that's what you'll decide, but we do build that into the forecast.
Okay.
And we still recommend, even with the 1%, that we implement the 2.5 cuts.
Okay. Even with the 1%. That's why I wanted clarification on. Thank you. Chair.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add just a little bit on the approach that the finance team took was really to try to balance our methodology between revenues and looking at, I would say, not just cuts for the sake of cuts, but of program evaluations and trying to see if there are reduction opportunities, because I do think we really cannot balance potentially without reductions. There are not councilmatic revenue options that allow us to balance at this point over that 6-year forecast. And so there are potentially going to the voters and those types of things, but over that 6-year period, and you're going to see it through the forecast that Emily shows you, there is no other really approach without reductions. And so really trying to come with a smoothed out, balanced way of looking at reductions over time, and then those different revenue options. And so she'll get into that. But yeah, trying to be as thoughtful as possible about doing this. So
Thanks
anyways.
for that clarification. That's helpful. Counselor Young, you had a comment?
Yes, I have a couple of questions. One is back, Mark, to your earlier comments on budgeting and vacancies. What I'm wondering, and I totally understand that you need to budget as if it's going, because if you hire those people, you got to pay them. But I'm wondering, like, when we look at the forecast and looking at future years, would it be a good idea to, because it's essentially we're building in as if we're 100% and no vacancy every single year, and we know that that's not really going to happen. And I'm wondering if maybe the year that we're working on, you count 100%, but then the following years you forecast some level of vacancy. I don't know if we would, because to me it makes it difficult to look at this forecast when I know that there are vacancy savings in there. We know there's going to be some level, we just don't know how much.
Right. I'll answer, and then Mark, I'm sure, has some feedback about that as well. I have talked to many other jurisdictions and municipalities about the way that they do this, and some do build in vacancy savings as part of their budgeting process. I think the risk to that is, and I mentioned this last year during the budget process, as council goes in and says, here's the forecast, here's the dollar amount that we're projecting is available for consideration. If that's built into future years as a given, and then the council goes ahead and appropriates all of the fund balance that we have, it really exacerbates that problem in future years, so that if it's overspent or if there's not the vacancy savings, they're not available, and then it's a future harder conversation to have. I just think there's a lot of risk in that, and I would just say if that's the direction that the county decides to go with forecasting, there needs to be consideration for policy discussions about if that is spent and those savings aren't realized. We just talked to someone in Buncombe County, North Carolina, that they have emergency supplementals all throughout the year to address those deficiencies by not fully budgeting their staff. And if there's no funding available to appropriate towards those staff because we're spending that, it creates a problem of having available funding. So that needs to be holistically discussed.
Yeah, maybe we can talk a little bit more about that, because when I look at this, I totally understand that thought process, but I'm also looking at like the sales tax revenue, right? We do our best guess to project, and we don't know what the answer is going to be. We don't know, and we will have to adjust accordingly. So it's kind of the same thing. But anyway, that can be held for a different conversation. Thank you for that answer. The other question that I had was, oh, yes. Okay. So looking at this screen, what we have on our screen right now, like I'm taking just the most obvious example, like Board of Equalization. A 2.5% cut means $4,243. How are they? I mean, realistic. I mean, the larger the department, you can cut an FTE. But when you're talking about such a tiny little department, the Board of Equalization, are they cutting flyers that they're sending? I mean, what do they do to achieve that?
Right. And that's part of the conversation that'd be forthcoming if this is the direction that is given by the councils to pursue this process through the budget adoption cycle. We would work with departments in office to talk about the reality of that. And as we prepare those requests to come through the budget process, there would be discussion about the impacts, what it would mean, and how those departments would absorb that. I don't know if anybody else.
Okay, so just can I ask just another question? So are you asking at this point to give us general direction? You'll work with the departments and then come back for a proposal that may not be just across the board 2.5%, or?
No, we're asking for direction to say we're going to prepare these cuts, and they'll come forward in the budget process as separate. So for my office, I would prepare a change request that cuts $22,000 from my budget and what the impacts would be. And those will all be grouped together for the council to consider as part of the budget process. Like, here's the cuts, and here's everything
Okay,
else.
but what you're going to bring forward to us literally is 2.5% from every single department.
Right now, that's the strategy proposed because we don't have any way to target specific departments and tell them that maybe they should cut versus others unless the council wanted to provide that feedback.
Okay, thank you.
Kathleen, you wanted to
Yeah,
say
I
something?
just wanted to say two things. One, just reiterate what Emily just said, and I gave you guys a little cheat sheet of what you're considering today during this process. So the recommendation is 2.5% for general fund. Council can direct that, do a different number, do something completely different. That's why we're looking for that direction today. And I also just want to be a little mindful, and I agree, smaller budgeted departments can have a great impact when you're looking at 2.5%. But I would probably, I think I'm safe to say that other departments that have larger budgets are going to say also it's going to impact their work. So I don't want to minimize a 2.5% reduction to the sheriff's office or to the assessor's office or the treasurer's office because they have a larger budget. You know, it's still going to have an impact. So I just don't want to minimize that comment.
Right, and I would just like to add, this comes after many years of belt tightening and still plenty of needs that are out there. So I'm assuming everybody could be impacted, and then we're going to be providing some direction, but there'll be a lot more information as we go down the road.
Yeah, and they're already feeling the impact for not having increased budget over the years because we've held a firm line because we're not balanced in the forecast.
Yeah. Wait.
Okay.
I just wanted to second what Emily said. I'm sorry, I don't know why I can't speak today. The use of expense savings when you're in the budget process, I think it has to be very carefully thought out. There, as Emily mentioned, there are jurisdictions that do that, but I think we really have to be careful. First of all, we need to fully budget. We need to show you what the true expense of what we're proposing or what you're proposing is. And then to look at the impact of that savings. If we had been doing that historically over time, we wouldn't have been able to balance over some of these salary adjustment years that we've had in the past. Right now, it appears that there might be an opportunity to do something, and we've kind of talked about that, but I think it has to be very carefully considered if we're going to do that at all. So.
And I would just third kind of the comments regarding the risks around pre-budgeting vacancy savings. I've been a part of jurisdictions who have budgeted vacancy savings. They typically do it in the year in which they're budgeting, and it's a very conscious decision. So budgeting like a 1.5% vacancy rate savings in that current year, but not over like an extended period of time where they're pre-assuming savings over like a 5-year period. There's a lot of assumed risks when you're thinking about healthcare costs, retirement costs, you know, a lot of different things that could escalate over that time. And so typically the way that I've seen it done in the jurisdictions that I've been a part of that have actually done that, anytime it's ever been done, it's been done in a current year based on some kind of a trend, you know, a vacancy rate trend that has been predictable. I will just say too, we are not experiencing vacancies at the rate that we have been experiencing vacancies. This market right now is much more stable and the turnover has really slowed down. That's one of the reasons why we're not seeing the salary savings. So that's another reason why if you get into that kind of sort of cycle of predicting vacancy savings, you can kind of get in a sticky situation. So anyways, it's just it has a high risk that is associated with it.
Great.
Thank you.
For that. Just one more question, if I may, on vacancies. Is there a way that we could analyze the vacancies, see where they're at, see if it's the same positions that are remaining open all the time, or if those vacancies are just a lot of fluctuating turnover, you know, just to get a better understanding on that?
We have a monthly report that HR does of all of our vacancies. We can certainly look at it. I also know, including in our office, and I know in the budget, if we're doing a reduction, we're holding on to a vacancy. We're not going to fill it if we're going to have to reduce and lay off. So there's some strategic vacancies. There's some some that come up as they're temporary ones because they're only staffed a few times a year, like lifeguards, if we're doing that. But yes, we do have reports on vacancies.
Okay, thank you.
And I just wanted to add one more thing, not to belabor this point, but it's important, as Sarah said, we bring back to the council as part of the budget adoption process any analysis we have for increased revenues or potential savings. And we put that into the forecast before decisions are finalized. We don't know that. We're about halfway through the year. We're seeing some trends like with sales tax, but how the rest of it's going to play out, we usually wait until like early fall to start saying, yeah, I think we're going to realize this, or this is a potential. And then we'll build that into the forecast for decision makings for that particular year's decisions.
Just a point of clarification or a question. Vacancy savings is an assumption that X amount of jobs aren't filled throughout the year. Okay. And then so we're saving based on not paying out a salary.
Yeah.
Right. Thanks.
Chair. One little other nuance that I would like for you to help me understand on this. So some of these, I mean, we talked about in, auditing the transfers from the general fund. I think that will become increasingly important to understand what percentage of the department's budget are general fund dollars. Because if a, tiny percent of it is general fund, but we take 2.5% of that, that's much different than if an entire, department's funded entirely by the general fund. So,
It is the next slide.
All right.
It's all right.
I thought I was the only one not doing that today, but here we go.
So ready for the next slide? Okay, so the next slide is the audit of general fund transfers and subsidies. And these are the baseline transfers out to other funds. It's about $14 million a year. And the finance team, along with the county manager, we're currently in process of evaluating each of these, the policy decisions that were made at the time to create these fund transfers. And we need to evaluate the operating impacts and the other side of these funds with each of the departments that are responsible for them. I would say some of these funds or some of these transfers are designated to pay for the general fund's portion of a service. And I think one of those examples might be the elections fund. There may be some things that are not able to be cut just across the board because it's a transfer supporting other services, but it is an obligation to the general fund. But we are working on that and we will continue to evaluate that. And if there's something we can bring forward as part of the budget process adoption, we will do so. But just for reference of consideration of what a 2.5% cut might look like to those transfers, that's that second column in blue. It is not a huge amount, but 350,000 year over year, that does add up. So it's something to consider. We'll have more information moving forward. These are a little bit more complicated to dig into. Yeah. Next slide, please. So this is the current general fund 6-year forecast that includes many of the proposed strategies and the 1% levy for 2027 only. In 2026, we have on the total capital budget line, we've reduced that $15 million obligation by the $7 million we proposed transferring to REIT 1. And then for 2027, that column there, that's the property tax, that 86.6 million represents the subordinate levies being removed from the general fund. It includes the 2.5% year over year growth anticipated, as well as the 1%. And then the strategic reductions recommendations section builds in the proposed revenue increases, both ongoing and one time. It reflects the 2.5% year over year cuts for general fund departments of about 5.6 million. And it just builds in that $350,000 transfer cut as a sake of conversation. Again, not knowing if that could be fully realized, we will continue to explore it. I think the biggest thing to note is that, if you look at the changes, and I feel very proud of the recommendations that the finance team's been able to present to bend this curve by bringing these forward to council for consideration. We are looking at about $20 million of increased available fund balance one time in 2027 for consideration for new critical operational needs and mandated services. Again, caution is highly advised to say that's really one time, because if you look at the curve going out, we're still seeing the structural deficit. We're still seeing that dip in 2030 about available fund balance for new requests. So it's not fixing the long-term solution, but it's a substantial, I think, win for consideration of how 2027 might play out.
Council, I just wanted to draw your attention to a couple of things in this proposal, or some of the things we're proposing. If you look at the 2026 forecast, the first column and the very bottom line, the difference between the operating revenues and operating expenses. So we're budgeting right now $14.6 million deficit. And we've had a lot of discussion on this as a finance team, trying to determine, well, how do we address that budgeted deficit? And if you look in the next column over, the 2027 column, by implementing some of these proposals, both revenue and expense, we've now decreased that budgeted deficit to about 10 million. So we're not trying to do this all at once. We're not trying to take a huge hit and fix this, but we do believe we have to take small incremental steps and fix it over time. So in this example, we would be able to, it's about 4.5 million, almost a $5 million change. And if we carry that out over a couple of years, we can get that revenue, the operating revenue and operating expenses back into balance. And that's kind of our long-term goal and our recommendation to the council, that we try and come up with a strategy that will do that over time so that departments can adjust to what that reality really is.
So the 20 million would be over a 6-year period. Is that correct?
The 20 million increase for 2027 is for 2027.
Just for 2027?
Then you can see the
One-time
ongoing.
fund balance.
Yeah, you can,
That's-
yeah.
Yeah, that was a one-time fund balance.
Is that the 1% that we could take councilmatically?
No, the 1%.
This is something else.
This is the accumulation of all of these proposed strategies in the forecast.
So the 20 million that Emily's referring to is, we have a fund balance, right? It's like what we have available now to spend. It's only one-time money, right? And so this improves our fund balance situation in 2027 because of the implementation of some of these strategies. So it helps our position so that we don't end up negative in the fund, which we never can do. We can't get there, so.
And I would just add, we've kind of been living off sort of one time to help us with that ongoing problem. And our one time has been incrementally helping us along the way to like Band-Aid us in that ongoing deficit that we've had. But essentially what's happening is our one time is being eroded to where we can't plug the hole. With the available one time that we have. We just don't have enough coming in. So eventually that's just not going to be the solution if we don't take some of these measures that we're talking about. So.
Sure. Can you explain, like, I mean, you did a good job explaining why the bottom line there, the deficit went from 14.6 to 9.9. But then why is it jumping? I know this is the 2028 doesn't include the 1%, but that's only like around $500,000.
It's about 800 to 900,000. Just
the 1%.
Yeah.
Okay. Then, but there's still 4 million more that's not accounted for. Why did it jump back up so much in 2028?
So the forecast assumes the increases, the year-over-year increases for salaries and benefits and other expenses, as well as those year-over-year increases for revenues. So in 2028, you'll see that the ongoing revenues are being outpaced by the ongoing projected expenses, even with those changes. So that is going to continue to increase year over year until that those are equitable. So we bend the curve so revenues and expenses are on par with each other. That bottom line will go away. But until that's the case, we're only band-aiding or bridging the gap with these solutions.
Okay, I'm still not quite understanding, because I mean the increase in the loss from 27 to 28 is 5 million, but then 28 to 29 to 30, and then so on is only like $1.5 million, something like that.
That's because the I'll have to double check on the 2027 calculations. I may have included some of those one times as part of that bottom calculation. When you look at 2028, you can look at the operating revenue is projected at 228 million, where the operating expenses is 245,000. And I can double check those numbers, but that's why it's higher.
Councilor, you have, for example, turn myself off. For example, if you look at in the light green in the center, we're taking a one-time revenue enhancement in interest income of almost $2 million. And then we're not carrying that forward because we can't project out what 2028 is going to bring in interest rates.
Okay,
So that's
so
$2 million
that-
right there.
That year differs because we're doing some refinements based on data that we know now.
Yes,
Okay.
We
but
go back
we're
to
not
baseline
predicting
for
it
that
to be the
revenue.
same in the future.
right.
Okay, understood. Thank you. That's good explanation.
The PUD privilege tax is also up there as a one-time as well. So there's about 3 million of revenue, almost, or 2.5.
2.5 million of your $4 million difference is those two items.
Thank you, guys. Any other questions on this slide? We'll go to the next slide, which is the same forecast, but it does build in that 1% year over year for years 2028 through 2032. And again, it doesn't fix the problem, but it does help. And I wanted to mention, I said this last year when we adopted the budget, we talked about if we had taken the 1% for every year subsequently, it would be substantial revenue. And with no other new considerations or new appropriation, we wouldn't be talking about a structural deficit or a fund balance deficit. The caution that as the budget director I want to provide is implementing these new revenues and taking these cuts and finding these solutions are going to be conversations we're going to have year over year, because each council will have to decide on new spending. That's going to happen no matter what. And it's going to be a continued balancing act. But by implementing that 1%, it does give us more capacity and room to absorb and take on those new things. And it does help bend the curve. I don't know if you guys have any additional comments or questions.
I would just say that this forecast, although it details the 1% across the board to 2032, it doesn't integrate that additional 2.5% cut that was mentioned in a previous slide, that a future council may consider in the 2028 budget process. And obviously that would have to be thoughtfully, decided and decisioned. But again, that would be decisioned across the curve, and again, create 2.5 million roughly over every single year, basically adding back to balance and then ongoing and just really closing the gap over time. And I think those are the kind of major decisions that have to be made, and they're huge priority decisions. And so without new revenues, though, there's really no other way to kind of close that gap, I don't think. So those are just kind of those big decisions that future council is going to have to grapple with. So, and it's not anticipated in this forecast.
And I just want to share also with the general fund forecast, prior councils have asked to not include it in the forecast. So it's only for what's being recommended each year. So that's why the 6-year forecast that normally is before you doesn't show it across the board. We can certainly change that and incorporate that. But as they mentioned, it is a one-time decision point for council. And then the second piece, and I know I've never said this publicly either, but we hear a lot about concerns with council implementing the 1% without the community voting on that. And in the past, and I don't remember the exact year, there was a statewide tax that people did vote that provided that authority for local jurisdictions to take the 1%. So the community has had a vote and said, yes, leave it to the local jurisdictions to make that decision. So I just wanted to say that because I've never said that publicly, but I think it's an important note for our community and for council to understand.
Chair, I think are you finished up, or?
I think Mark might have one more comment.
It was 2001, Kathleen. 2001 and reaffirmed by the legislature in 2004 that voters approved the 1%, or it went from 6% to 1%.
Let's hear that again. It went from
It was originally limited at 6%,
limited at 6%.
and it was limited to 1%,
In
and then reaffirmed by the
2001.
legislature in 2004.
Okay.
So it was approved by voters in 2001.
Do we know what our history was as far as taking that? Well, just theoretical.
We don't.
All right.
I was gonna say, I don't think we have it back to that far, but we did share during the budget process that I believe it was like 6 times out of the prior 12 that we did not take it, which cost us just over $37 million, and it would have cost a homeowner about $22 a year.
Right. And that's just the 1% that we're limited to. Thank you.
Sure. Couple more questions from earlier on in the presentation that I was just waiting on. So first of all, the 7 million from the capital, the general fund capital to REIT 2, what is the background behind that? And what I'm wondering is that just, I mean, what caused the availability of the 7 million from REIT 2 to be able to be considered for this? And is that something that's recurring? Can you just add a little bit to that?
Sure, I'll start and then of course we can add into that. So with REIT 2, it's very much programmed out for mostly public works capital master plans. The council's provided direction in prior years. And what the finance team did was we took a look at that and we said, is this a possibility? Is it something we could move? And since that time, a couple months ago, I worked with the Public Works Department and discussed how that could be absorbed and how they might be able to adjust their planning to absorb that 7 million as a one-time situation. REIT 2 has been expanded for more allowable uses over the past year, and we just thought it might be an opportunity, and it looks like it will actually be able to be realized. It is not an ongoing thing. Any ongoing changes to how capital projects are appropriated, so if like facilities comes forward with many, and they have many needs, consideration for REIT 2 will become a balancing act because of those public works master planning activities. And we can talk about that as part of the annual budget process, but this is a one-time only solution.
Okay, yeah, because I would be interested in what kind of things are given up by doing that. You know, what kind of projects?
At this time, I think we've found a balance where there's nothing that's really being given up. We're able to smooth out the 6-year forecast, but future commitments to that fund beyond that would probably mean
Okay.
Public Works would have to come forward. And
First thing
create
that comes to my mind when I think of that is 179th.
Yeah.
All right.
I would just mention we did actually just talk to Public Works about funding for 179th, and it appears that the funding for those projects is largely around state and federal grants, and that road fund is just a small component of the funding for that large projects, and it is committed, and I don't think there's any concerns about the funding for that project.
Yeah, I'm just wondering whether things can be pushed forward faster or something. Anyway, that's a different conversation, different day.
I did want to mention, though, with capital projects in the general fund versus committing them to capital funds, you know, when we think about the general fund, we think about really what's the highest and best uses of expenses in a fund like the general fund, which is your most discretionary fund. And I think a lot of times we want to apply the principle that we want to commit expenses to the most restricted funds first, if at all possible. And so capital projects going to capital funds wherever possible, you know, can they go to, you know, REIT? Can they go to a clean water fund? Can they go to any sort of other fund first before the discretionary fund of the general fund? Because that's our most precious resource that we have only to spend on funds that can get funded by nothing else. And so I think that's the kind of principle we applied in this circumstance. And so that's kind of what the lens that we had on when we were looking at those. This is a potential solution for your consideration.
Sure. And I definitely appreciate that effort. It is important. The only thing that concerns me about it is it can tend to mask an underlying problem. So, but thank you. My last question would be, so this data that the forecast that you've given us, one shows 1%, one doesn't show 1%, but they all consider a 2.5% across the board cut. And my question would be, when we're looking at this, it still shows we have a problem that we haven't solved yet. So my question, I mean, we're talking about we have a few different potential and upcoming revenue sources. There's the criminal justice sales tax that's coming very soon. And then we're talking about, potential levy from the jail. We know that the criminal justice sales tax, we could use that to supplant and cover this deficit potentially, if that's what we chose to do. My question would be, if we were to make the decision not to supplant the general fund with the criminal justice sales tax, and we weren't able to pass any levy, or the amount of the levy was only able to cover the jail and those expenses directly, what level of cut would we have to do today to curb this?
I'll start with the criminal justice sales tax. You have not maxed out that expense, so you could use that to cut it. If you do not address it and we continue to increase, if you were to take the criminal justice sales tax and increase, say, sheriff deputies and not address the deficit, unfortunately, we're still going to have to reduce, and that's going to impact the sheriff's office and the jail and everybody else who's in general funds. So people may be paying more money but have less service. And I think the goal of the recommendation, the 2.5%, is, I think there's acknowledgement it doesn't fix the problem, but it's a slower response so that we can adjust better and go through the other options that we have available.
Yes, and I completely understand that. I'm just curious though, if the worst case scenario happens with our funding with the levy, if it weren't to pass, or again the other things that I said, what actually is the deficit that we would need to cover to be whole?
And I think if you could go back, Jake, a couple slides to the one that shows just the 1% for 2027. It's like 2 slides, not this one, but this one, yes. So it really depends, because right now this doesn't reflect any of the mandated needs that will have to be considered as part of the department's submissions for the annual budget process. Based on what has to be budgeted and no new additional services or new additional services and people with additional revenues, you're looking at, we have a good fund balance for 2027 if these items are implemented, but that problem will be exacerbated by the decisions as part of this annual budget process. Once you plug in those new expenses, that's going to offset those future years down from what's available there. So it really depends. And knowing what's going to happen with the budget adoption and these new revenue options and what the voters approve, we would really want to come back again probably next year to reassess that, again, depending on what decisions the council feels they need to implement for 2027 in December.
Okay.
It's hard to say, but we can plug numbers in, but it's really dependent on some other decisions that will be made.
So, and maybe I wasn't very clear. So like, for example, taking a look at this slide right here, each year the very bottom column is a deficit. So if the only variable that we changed in this spreadsheet was the percentage cut across the board to make that bottom line 0, what would that be? I don't expect that you have that right now, but that is something that I would be interested in understanding, like what percentage cut across the board would be needed if we don't locate any new revenue sources to maintain services as they are today.
And we would take, I would believe we would take the structural deficit as a percentage of the general fund, and it would be that to make that 0 out. But we can come back and give you those final numbers.
Yeah,
Thank
because
you.
it would be the red number that you're seeing, the 9.8.
Right, but I
and the
mean,
14.
like change, what percent would it go to from 2% to 5% to 7%,
Well, if 2.5% is 5.6 million, it probably at least 10% for 2027. And
It
then
would be
future
like
years would be more.
3 times essentially. So it'd be like 7%, right? 7.5%.
7.5%.
Okay. Yeah, thank you for pointing that out. That's the easy way to look at it. Okay. Thank you.
And just as a reminder, this doesn't include any new requests,
Correct.
which
Yep.
there will be some, and there's
Mhm.
some that are mandated. So
So you
this
can't
does-
fill the new requests at the same time you're cutting from their existing capacity.
Well, that we're going to have new requests that's going to impact this that we can't say no to because they're
Gotcha.
mandated.
Yeah, correct. Thanks. Thank you. This was very helpful.
You're welcome.
Okay, and so now, you're looking for some direction from us?
Yes, mostly on, for me, for the budget process, we're right in the throes of getting things ready for departments and offices to prepare their submissions. So knowing a council direction on that 2.5% or whatever recommendation you may have will be helpful so that we can implement and work with them on that through the budget process.
Right, and I think we've all received from the county manager, options for us to consider. So, I think one thing maybe if you could clarify, departments, offices submit their needs for all funds. Would that be what they have done year after year?
Yes. So last year we had this separate process
Right.
between what was mandatory versus critical needs that were not necessarily mandatory. And so I did have a counselor ask about only having items submitted in the budget process be mandatory. If you're asking for a recommendation, I'd recommend allowing the departments to submit what their needs are and they can identify what is mandatory so that the council and the public is still aware of what the needs are, even if we cannot fund it.
Okay, so they would be submitting their full needs, but they would indicate within that what is mandatory?
Yes.
Okay,
And then also the recommendation is that 2.5% reduction scenario for them to include.
right.
Chair.
Yes, go ahead.
I have a comment, and I'd be supportive of moving forward with the 2.5% reduction, but I would like to start seeing more publicly facing, showing the actual true number, like the 7 or 7.5% of what it should be, so that we can really start establishing the record to the public that we have a real problem, and if we are not able to solve it with some new sources of revenue, that these cuts are coming, coming down the pipeline. And then I feel like I'm a little bit uncertain about and I know with all of our conversations, our county manager, one of the biggest things that I have noticed from her is she is about fairness all the time. And I think that's a really good quality that she has. In this particular instance, however, I feel like we should give the county manager some ability to be flexible. And what I mean is, for example, and I don't know this because we're not the executive branch, but to me, what stands out is, for instance, if you cut our IT, we may end up with a serious problem that ends up costing the county millions, literally. So there are some departments, every department and everything they do, I appreciate it, and it's so needed. We know that you don't have enough resources to do what is expected of you, but there are consequences that vary differently from department to department when cuts are made. So I would ask to consider not just a flat 2.5%, use that fairness lens that you have, but also prioritize and think about the long-term consequences of the cuts being made to that particular department.
Yeah, I think what you're asking for is some level of risk assessment related to that. And I think the 2.5% cut across the board is an exercise, and that we'll glean more information when we look at that and make some policy decisions related to that. So I would support the county manager's recommendation for departments and offices to submit their needs for all funds, and to have the departments and offices submit a 2.5 reduction scenario for the general fund.
Can I ask a question
Others?
for
Yes.
Counselor Young? I know the 6-year forecast, there's a lot of information on there. And I assume we can add one little tiny line when you're talking about the reality for the true reduction or percentage. Under that last pink line, do you want us to put the percentage of the general fund that we would have to take to balance? Is that sufficient?
Sure, I think that would be okay.
Makes
And,
sense. Okay.
and maybe put that in dollar numbers too.
The dollars are already there because it's that negative number. So if it's negative 10 million, we got to
Oh,
get
yeah,
10
that's
million.
fair enough. Yeah.
So we'll
Obvious,
take
yep,
the,
yep.
we'll just say what the percentage is.
Yeah, that would be great. Perfect.
We'll do that, no problem.
And I would just like to mention, because this came up last budgeting cycle, that the project positions that are hired that are for 2 years, not to exceed 2 years, and so they don't show up going forward as far as expenses, but a number of those positions, I believe, are really needed permanently. So that's just a problem that it makes things look a lot better than it really is if we considered which of those positions really ought to be permanent positions, and we're calling them project positions.
And I would also add, and Emily can give numbers, but we've had a significant number of FTE requests for the 2028. We can't pay for them. So would you like to see what every request is, include the project positions? Because that's, because I will not recommend something that we can't fund.
I don't expect you to, but I expect that some of the departments will come in and tell us about it.
Chair, if I may add that, I think that's a good point. And for me, it's not so much like making those permanent, but I think these numbers don't really display those as ongoing expenses. So I think that's kind of maybe what you're trying to say is in this particular thing, when we're talking about the 7.5%, I mean, that doesn't account for positions that are temporary right now that really should be ongoing.
Right. And I just might add what we can do and what we plan to do through this budget process is we will receive all of those requests from departments and offices per direction today. Everybody can submit what they need, and those will be calculated and presented to the council so you can see what those impacts would be. And I would say many departments and offices, the project positions are extremely challenging. It's hard to retain people. It's hard to get people to commit to anything long-term when they know it's not a permanent position. But that's the same question we have is if there's no ongoing revenue source to pay for those, they won't be able to be recommended, right? But we'll bring that information to you. And the last thing I wanted to say is one thing we did glean from last year's budget process, that general fund critical needs exercise we went through was the opportunity for departments and offices to come forward to the council directly in a work session. And we've got that scheduled. It will happen prior to the county manager's recommendations. So each of them can say, here's my full request. Here's what I need. Here's what my cuts are and what it means to me. And then you'll have all that information as recommendations are developed and final process goes forward for the budget adopt. So you'll get that to consider.
Great. Thank you. And then just my very last comment, I promise, and I'll zip it, is I think I figured out a better way to say what I had said earlier about not necessarily 2.5 to every single department. I think we need to look at this from the lens of what is the impact to the public of these changes. And so I think we should evaluate that, and there should be some flexibility based on the impact to the public.
And departments should provide those impacts in their submissions. So we'll have that information for you.
Great, thank you.
And even with the project, I think that it's good for the public to understand what we're grappling with here. And so that's why I bring up those project positions, because that's something we struggle with. And it isn't fully reflected as you look at those numbers going out.
So, just to get your guys' feedback on that, and I agree, project positions are not ideal. They're hard to, even though we're giving them 2 more years every year. Because, as I look at FTEs that are coming in, if it's not sustainable, to me, that was a little Band-Aid, a little carrot to help them limp along. Otherwise, if we didn't have that option, I wouldn't be recommending any positions. And so, we'll find a way to really articulate, what the FTE request is and the impact. But I mean, to me, that was the Band-Aid fix, because I agree with you. They should be permanent and ongoing. But if we don't have it and we can't sustain it, and if you looked at all the critical needs last year that was submitted, that we would have been upside down. We wouldn't be balanced at all. It's a tough thing, but I'm open to your guys' feedback on what would be helpful for you as you're considering this as well. But that's been my lens in looking at it, is if we don't balance, I can't recommend it, but what could we do one time with one-time funding, which would be a 2-year, just to give them something?
It's the Band-Aid is not big enough for the wound that we're experiencing.
Yeah. And I also think that, we're finalizing, the consultant that's going to come help you guys with facilitating policy priorities, because that's also going to be helpful in the recommendations when you're looking at the impact to the public. That's a policy decision. What's acceptable level of service is a policy decision. So I think knowing what your guys' priorities are, I mean, is it, to make sure that every park has green grass year round and we're watering, or is it that not, or that level of service, or turning around, I don't know, an application for something that now takes 2 weeks could take now 2 months. Those are policy decisions, because that's all tied to budget as well. So hopefully that conversation will help provide.
Thank you. Councilor Belcott, did you want to add anything?
Yes, I'm not sure why my hand raising thing isn't working. I don't know if you can
I'm
see
sorry.
that. It's okay. It's not working for some weird reason. I am interested in, and I've mentioned this before in the past, at the empty unhired FTEs, so that we could compare and contrast. And I know that we're talking about critical staff members, but also maybe not hiring those FTEs, or seeing what's around the different departments around the county. I know that when I worked for public health way back in the day, that was something that was being done then. We just weren't back hiring our FTEs as to save money, or maybe like one of the things you just mentioned, Kathleen, about watering the grass, deferred maintenance. I've lived in areas before in the past where, because there was a budget crunch, what can we do for deferred maintenance purposes to save money? Something, of that might benefit us, something that's not going to be like obviously an emergency type situation, but maybe that we can put it off for a little bit. So those were just some of my thoughts.
Thank you. Do you want me to ask? Oh, Councilor Belcott, are you supportive of the county manager's recommendation related to the department's budgeting and submitting for all of their needs, and the 2.5% reduction scenarios?
Yes. Yep.
Yes. Okay. Thank you. Anyone else?
Sure. Yeah. It's always uncomfortable to have these type of conversations, right? When we're looking at reducing our budget as a result of our structural deficit, and of course the impact that it's going to have on the services that we provide. I don't know that we have another option at this point, and so I will support the 2.5. And then with the flexibility for the county manager to figure out where the most critical reductions need to be. In addition to, actually, I lost my train of thought. So I'll support staff recommendations for now.
Thank you. Thank you for all your work on this and making it as digestible as you have. And we'll look forward to further conversation. So really appreciate your work.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.